Check, check, 1, 2. Hello, everyone. I encourage you to come in and take your seats. We're going to get started in a few minutes. They changed it. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Hi, it's a pleasure to see so many of you here today and see so many students here. My name is Linda Scott. I am the Dean for the School of Nursing, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you here. We are honored to be here this evening to co-sponsor this event with the Collaborative Center for Health Equity and to partner with the All of Us initiative. Tonight's event also provides a wonderful opportunity to showcase nursing science and to learn more about the importance of diversity in research. So at this time, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Mel Freitag, our diversity officer in the School of Nursing, to the podium to tell you more about our commitment to inclusive excellence and to introduce Dr. Andrea Gilmore-Bykowski as our keynote speaker. Dr. Freitag.
So I had to remember to put my little I voted sticker, so please remember to vote today. My name is Dr. Mel Freitag. I'm the diversity officer here in the School of Nursing. Thanks, everyone, for coming out tonight. I am really excited about this event tonight because it's about two concepts that often students especially don't think go together: diversity, equity, and inclusion, and research. A lot of times, we used to have a research class in the School of Nursing, and a lot of times when the students would enroll in it and take it, they're like, I don't get what research has to do with what I'm going to do. I don't get what it has to do with practice, with my healthcare practice, with my nursing practice. Why do we need this? Why do we care about it? It seems so divorced. It's going to be just about publications in some random journal, and only faculty are going to read it amongst themselves. So why should I care about it if I'm going to be a nurse practicing? And so we heard this a lot, and we wanted to respond to that by thinking about ways in which our students could really see research in action. And I think that this event in particular is to have dialogue about the research in action at a very local level. And so we have some great experts on the panel today to talk about that. In addition to thinking about research, it also has to relate to policy and system level change. We have an early entry PhD program here. We have some stellar graduates where they go right from their undergrad to their PhD. And one student in particular was able to see organizational change in her bachelor's level program. And she said, is this research? Is this what you do? You actually can impact policy and recommendations for what changes can be made. And she could see that impact. And so she went on to the early entry PhD program, and now she's in a postdoc program. I think it's really important to think about research and action. And then you start to relate it to equity and diversity and inclusion. So that's a whole other realm of thinking about representation, right? And so underrepresented groups in research have historically not been as represented in research. And, you can look at the Tuskegee study and some other things that we look at historically for that. There has been historical distrust in healthcare systems. And in order to really look at why that happens, in addition to looking at the historical roots of that, it's also important to look at why health studies have been so white. And so there's a recent article out called Why Are Health Studies So White that I encourage you to read, because it's important to look at the norms of the system and the default whiteness within a system before you start to look at how to change it. And so a lot of the researchers that are going to be talking today and people involved in research are going to talk about how to intervene within those systems and really build real and authentic equitable practices to change health outcomes. If people aren't at the table, if people aren't in the research studies, and if they're not in the big data, if the populations just aren't there, then their health outcomes are going to suffer because their interventions are not going to be culturally tailored, and it's not going to be culturally relevant or culturally congruent research. This can change people's lives. If you look at mortality rates, if you look at even health disparities within Dane County at a local level, this can really change people's lives. It can change whether or not people live or die and when they live or die. We know that zip code matters. We know that socioeconomic status matters. But unless we start asking those specific questions more often and start to build that data, then we're not going to be able to build recommendations, interventions that are culturally appropriate and really can change, like I said, not only when people when people die, but how they live and die. And so that's what I wanted to say, and I hope this is really a call to action, not only to sign up for a PhD or think about PhD programs, although I always like to plug that, but also think about how research intersects with equity and diversity and inclusion, and what you can do about it, and how you can start to change systems and put your own role and your own practice into action and be a social justice advocate. Thank you. Dr. Andrea is going to be introducing herself.
Right. Thank you so much, Mel. It's really wonderful to see everyone here. Mel just stole my thunder, so we could almost call it a wrap, but I have a few more things that I want to squeeze in. I am Andrea Gilmer-Bukowski, as you may have guessed. I have the great privilege of being an assistant professor here in the School of Nursing, and I'm really excited to be here today to talk about a topic that has become increasingly really central to some of my research and work, but also a topic that I think is becoming nationally and at some point globally an undercurrent with our dialogue around health delivery, health outcomes, and health equity. And what I'm going to try to do in my time today is explain just why that might be. So what I'm going to do, I always like to have goals so I stay somewhat focused. I'm going to try to talk, and I have to try to get, hold on. Okay, I can now see my slides here. That'll be easier for me. I'm going to talk a little bit about the ways in which equity in research and healthcare delivery at the bedside really go hand in hand, and try to articulate why we need to look at these different concepts together. I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of representation in health-related research and the sources of some of the challenges that we see. Is this echoing a lot? Should I? I'm good? I just hear my echo. Okay, that's cool. All right, and I'm going to talk about practical strategies that I hope we all can walk away with and things that we could do to implement changes in our day-to-day work, myself included, to try to advance research and health equity. And we're going to end with a panel, so there will be a chance to ask questions. I'll be on the panel in addition to representatives from other local programs and initiatives who are working in this space. Okay, so I know that there are students here, and similar to Mel, I always like to do a little, why would anyone ever want a PhD or want to torture themselves by doing research forever plug? Because there are reasons that we do these things. And just as a way of an introduction of myself and what I do. So my clinical background is in geriatric nursing. I am a practicing nurse. I practice as an RN in inpatient geriatric psychiatry, which is really important to me, and the work that I do in my research. And I lead here in the School of Nursing an interdisciplinary research program where we really work to address gaps and disparities in care for people with Alzheimer's and related dementia. So for those that aren't familiar, I'll presume most of us are, because we all tend to be impacted by this one way or another. But dementia is a form of conditions that lead to progressive and irreversible losses in cognition, and ultimately is a life-limiting illness. And I'm going to use dementia as a use case when I talk about how some of this shows up at the bedside. And why would I ever want to do this? So my introduction to nursing really was in a setting that looked a lot like this. I came to this campus, I was really excited about stuff, I'm still excited, and I really wanted to do something with science. I thought I liked this idea that I could ask a question and actually maybe somehow develop competence to answer it in a reliable way. I thought that was a fun concept, but it lacked a kind of humanness that I really thought was important. And was introduced to nursing and discovered that nurses also do science, and I was like, that's a win, I'm going to go with that. And I became a CNA and worked in a skilled nursing facility that looked very much like what you see in these pictures here, and it was really a very life-changing experience for me. And I think I would summarize it by saying I was very motivated by the rewards that I felt in working with people. Most of the residents I cared for had dementia, and this desire to create moments of meaning with individuals that really were living moment to moment. But I also was very distraught and frustrated by our healthcare system that seemed to be on a mission to systematically make good care impossible for a very vulnerable population. So I became really interested in understanding the disparities that I saw for a vulnerable population, which are individuals with cognitive impairment. And as I've progressed in my career, have really developed a heightened awareness of there are other layers to this problem. And in the case of dementia, what we know is that members of certain groups, particularly historically underrepresented or disadvantaged groups, there are many labels that are used here, are at much higher risk for developing dementia. But there are not a lot of research studies that I've done, that my colleagues have done, or that I see in the published literature, which is a problem for many reasons that I'm going to come to in a bit. We know that African Americans and Native Americans in particular seem to be about 2 times more likely to develop dementia than non-Hispanic whites. We also know that Latinx populations seem to be about 1.5 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's or dementia. And all of these estimates, we have a good degree of confidence in them, but I do have to say that they come from data sets that grossly underrepresent these populations in the first place. So that's really challenging. We also know that demographics in our country are changing, and as you can see here, projected in 2030, we're going to start to get to a point where racial and ethnic minority populations are going to start to account for closer to 50% of the population, and eventually, sometime after, that's going to kind of continue to advance, where we'll see racial and ethnic minorities account for the majority of the population. So what that tells us is that if you're not in the business of knowing how to provide care for people with dementia, get on board. I'll put in a plug for that, because our demographics are changing, and those at highest risk are members of populations that are growing at the fastest rates currently. So I want to acknowledge that when we think about disparities, we think about infographics like this, and I'm guilty of this as well, but we really often think about racial disparities, black-white disparities, and that's one piece of the picture. But I want to make sure we all have a shared understanding of the fact that disparities operate on many dimensions in this country and globally, and these are dimensions that cross both race and ethnicity, but also economic, social, and environmental factors. So Healthy People 2020, I think, has a pretty comprehensive definition for us to use, which is understanding that a health disparity is a particular type of health difference that's closely linked with economic, social, or environmental disadvantage, and those sources of disadvantage disproportionately burden certain populations. And these are populations, if you're familiar with the term othering, these may be members of communities that historically or in present day experience a lot of othering. So sex and gender minorities, racial and ethnic minorities, individuals with challenges in mental health, cognitive or sensory deficits, people that are from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So these things work across multiple different sectors, and it's really important that we broaden our view of health disparities because this tells us how we intervene and what we do about it. And how I see this, and others who are in the field of dementia see this play out, is that we see that disparities in dementia don't just run along the race and ethnicity lines, but they also run along contextual factors, socioeconomic status, physical environment. There is emerging research, much of which is being done right now at UW-Madison, that's suggesting that exposure to neighborhoods that are disadvantaged, neighborhoods, for example, where it's challenging to walk safely outside, where it's challenging to get access to fresh food, that long-term exposure to these environments really increases your risk for cognitive decline and other things. And we're even seeing that, I understand, in some of the biomarkers that we look at for Alzheimer's and dementia. We know that exposure to air pollution and toxins is increasing risk for Alzheimer's and dementia. And we also know that most dementia in the world is actually in low and middle income countries. So this is all evidence suggesting that race and ethnicity is important, but in this context, we need to think a little more broadly. So what does this mean for us at the bedside? It means that we see other forms of disparities that trickle down. This means people are diagnosed at later disease stages, they have greater disease burden, they don't respond to treatment as well, even though we have very limited treatment in this case. They often suffer greater economic burden, and in some cases, experiences with stigma can be different. So this comes to us when we encounter patients and families at the bedside. And models help us understand, if anyone's taken theory with me, I apologize for going back to this again, but models help us understand how things interact and what we should do about it. So the National Institute on Aging, I think, has a really helpful model for how we think about health disparities and reminding us, again, environmental, sociocultural, behavioral, and biological. For nursing students here, I have been told that we have, I think, covered social determinants of health, but just in case others haven't been exposed, we do know that socioeconomic factors and physical environment factors, these are determinants of about 50% of health outcomes on a rough average. That's really important. So if we omit this in how we think about interactions with people, we're missing a huge opportunity to improve health equity. And I want to introduce the idea that there's another source or factor that is exacerbating these multiple mechanisms of disparities, and I think that that's underrepresentation in research. And I'm going to talk about why that is. So I found it very difficult to identify accurate estimates of the extent of underrepresentation in research in my field, which probably speaks to how much this is a problem, considering that we know that populations at highest risk are racial and ethnic minorities. But I have identified that it looks like less than about 10% of NIH-funded studies on Alzheimer's and dementia, and these are primarily clinical trials, represent members from these underrepresented groups. So those with the greatest disease burden are being included at very low rates. This is even lower than their proportion demographically in the population. And what we know is that we actually want to include them at higher rates so we can elucidate why we're seeing these disparities. And I'm going to move on from dementia. That's a use case. I might come back to it later. But if we look more broadly at NIH-funded research, I just want to demonstrate that this doesn't really look very good. So what you can see here is that African Americans account for about 11% of participants in NIH-funded studies. For Hispanic population, we're at about 8.3%. And American Indian, Alaskan Native, 0.7%. All of these are at lower than their equivalent proportion demographically in the country, and I just want you to know this number really has not changed at all over the last about 10 years. So we haven't made a lot of progress. An important question, this might look familiar for when you think about medical ethics. An important question that when we talk about science, and questions scientists need to ask themselves as they progress in research, are questions about balancing these factors of respecting autonomy, meaning people should choose to be involved in research. So when someone's approached, you can't just be included in an NIH-funded study. You need to understand the risks and benefits and provide informed consent. We need to balance beneficence, which means that we are really thoughtful about minimizing risk for harm, maximizing the likelihood of benefit. And there's another principle that I want to bring your attention to, and that's the principle of justice. And justice calls upon us to ask the question, who ought to bear the burdens of research and who ought to receive its benefits? And historically, when we talk about justice, we have rightfully been very concerned about not overburdening populations that are vulnerable and have in the past been taken advantage of. But there's another side of that spectrum, which is we need to be really careful to not systematically exclude populations that, if excluded, will not benefit from the outcomes of research. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the consequences of some of that exclusion now. So what are the consequences when that pendulum and justice isn't quite where it needs to be in terms of research inclusion and representation? And these are all things that have implications for the medications that are available for our patients, the interventions that are available, and also experiences in moving through the care system. One really obvious outcome is that we have underdeveloped theories of disease mechanisms, the risk factors, and the protective factors. If we really focus on a homogeneous population, we develop ideas about how disease develops that apply only to that population, potentially. We certainly, in my field of Alzheimer's, we miss opportunities to identify therapeutic targets. I think everyone here would be on board for the Alzheimer's drug tomorrow, but if the individuals that are at greatest risk are not included in those drug trials, we really have omitted a really important opportunity to identify and better understand potential targets. We can't adequately inform resource allocation or prevention. And something that I find very concerning is we really don't know, we can't elucidate the mechanisms of disparities themselves if we don't include the populations that experience the greatest health disparities. So we're really at a disadvantage there. And as a clinician, I think very importantly, as Mel had alluded to, our treatments, interventions, our care approaches, the social services our patients are referred to are generally not developed for, tested in, or suited to the diversity of our population, which means that we can't have full confidence that perhaps this was tested in 3 randomized controlled trials. Less than 10% of that population, however, looked anything like my population, so we really don't have confidence about the cultural appropriateness of many of our treatments. Yet, I do believe still in research, and we understand that research is an important conduit to health, and this is what it's supposed to look like. This is the dream here, and there are many examples. For example, HIV is no longer a terminal condition, it's now a chronic condition. There are many relevant use cases within which we have seen wonderful success from going from basic bench research to bedside clinical research and then translating that into care. The unfortunate reality still for many conditions is that we go through these cycles. There are problems with translation. That's another event at another point in time. But there are also some serious problems with underrepresentation that mean that we kind of get to improved health, but we get there for some people. And we don't seem to get there for some of the populations that experience great disease burden in many cases. And what exactly is getting in the way? So I want to propose that there are a lot of things, but there are 4 concepts that I want to walk us through that are barriers. And I say barriers wanting to, not blaming participants or scientists, thinking of this as just a general, there's no blame here in the use of the term barriers, but thinking about issues with access, issues with inclusion, issues with bias, and issues with relationships. And I'm going to kind of progress through talking about some examples of how these things really exacerbate underrepresentation, and then move on to talking about what exactly we might do about it. So inclusion. There are lots of ways in which inadvertently, for letting me do that, inadvertently scientists might exclude certain populations by virtue of their who they allow into their study. So very often we have eligibility criteria. They may be very strict, and if you exclude everyone who has a chronic condition from your study, I can tell you right now you've excluded the vast majority of African Americans, probably a good number of Hispanic populations that we know are at much greater risk for poor cardiovascular disease outcomes. So we really need to be thoughtful about who we even let in, and we need to think about that as an inclusion issue. Our recruitment strategies might exclude certain populations if we only go to PCP offices to recruit. Individuals that don't go to that PCP office obviously won't have access to our study. There are other issues in terms of how we set up research in a way that creates systematic barriers to participating. So, for example, if people have difficulty with some basic needs in the area, for example, respite care, child care, transportation, not having adequate time to do extra things in your life, why would you make time for my research study? We need to understand the barriers that people have in their day-to-day lives based on kind of their social position and resources. And language and health literacy is a huge area where many people don't have access to our studies because we conduct most of our work in English, and I know it is news to some of us and me at times, but not everybody speaks English in a way in which they can access and participate in a research study. Bias, I think, is really important, and there certainly are challenges with, I think, an inaccurate assumption that some populations just don't want to participate in research. We see this a lot in some of our recruitment efforts in terms of who people are willing to reach out to. And describing some groups as hard to reach, I don't know if you're familiar with that terminology. Talking about populations as hard to reach homogenizes very diverse groups and kind of makes us think that they're off limits. They're hard to reach most often because they've been accessed in inappropriate ways and have had negative experiences. So how we frame these problems can be really challenging. And lastly, I'm going to talk a lot about relationship and the ways in which relationship, both in terms of how we understand historical violations and issues of mistrust, but also more contemporary issues related to societal discrimination, can serve as a real barrier if we don't address them very proactively. So different views on barriers. In my lab, we've been doing some very fun work talking to, as it happens, people with mild cognitive impairment and their caregivers about their views about being approached to participate in research, and have been reading a lot in this area in general. And it's really interesting to kind of dichotomize how a participant might talk about barriers and how scientists write and talk about barriers. So things, I'm sure I've been guilty of saying some of these things before myself. But for example, describing people as lacking knowledge, not understanding the research process, having poor health literacy, people not being trusting, a legacy of ethical violations, and a lack of interest or motivation, as though somebody needs to be motivated to participate in my research. So there are lots of assumptions in how we talk about some of these things that aren't really doing us any favors, I don't think. How participants might talk about barriers or experience them is perhaps research has not been explained to me in a way I understand. Oftentimes, I don't understand research that my colleagues are doing. It's really complicated. Issues related to translation of information and how we do or do not use plain language. Research is very similar to my healthcare, and it's hard to separate. This is pretty factual, particularly if you take the case of cancer trials. It's very hard to understand what's my healthcare and what's research, and why do I need to specifically identify research as being different. Research studies are not clearly described. I see that very often in my own informed consent documents. I have many reasons to feel unsure about whether I have confidence in experiments performed on me by people I do not personally know, So this idea that some reticence that people may have to participate in research is actually really logical, is something that we don't always acknowledge. And after learning about ethical violations in research, it's logical for me to also be concerned about research safety. Also, probably a legit experience that someone might have. You might not be studying something that's important to me, or clearly you haven't convinced me. So you can see here that we're not really coming together with a common language for how we think about these barriers of issues with access, inclusion, bias, and relationships, and thinking about ways we might meet in the middle. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the issues related to relationship because they're really quite important. And we do know that we have, in this country and in other countries as well, a long history of violations, ethical violations in the conduct of research. And these are some notorious examples of which, unfortunately, I had to choose from a lot when deciding which to talk about. Most commonly, people are familiar with the Tuskegee syphilis study, which is a study that was conducted with primarily poor African Americans who some had syphilis and some did not, and the goal of the study was to study the natural evolution of syphilis, which of course was a huge human health problem at the time. However, upon identifying that penicillin was effective in treating syphilis, members or participants in the study were not informed of that, and they weren't treated. So there's one dose of disturbing for us for today. And some time later, there, of course, was a formal apology. And here, the person that you see is Ben Sherman, who's a survivor of the Tuskegee syphilis study. And a similar case that is a little bit, I suppose, less widely known is the Guatemalan syphilis study, which is similar but dissimilar in the fact that in this particular study, and in both studies, there was no informed consent. So we're already getting a F minus here. In this particular study, individuals were actually exposed to syphilis in addition to other STDs, primarily members of vulnerable populations, most of which were never fully treated, and many people actually died as a result of that study. There's a lot of remaining controversy around the adequacy of apologies and what's been done with that particular study. Also, somewhat widely known is violations that took place with the Havasupai tribe, where they had given permission for their DNA samples to be used in one context, but they were used in many other contexts without their permission or informed consent. And just recently now, a case with Southern Illinois University, and I believe vaccine testing being done in St. Kitts and Nevis Islands without IRB approval, et cetera, et cetera. So the point here is that this is not really a thing of the past, and certainly if you're in a community that's kind of experienced some of these events, this could feel really current to you. This is obviously deeply upsetting, probably even if we're not members of these communities. And I want to talk a little bit about, these are kind of extreme examples. You know, this will wake you up at night for sure. But I want to talk a little bit more about how these things might play out in kind of day-to-day, how people that we approach have experienced life. And this is actually my parents. So if you're wondering if the whole reason I'm giving this talk is to let you know that I had very good-looking parents and they are still here, yes, you're right. That's a big part of it. So this is my parents' wedding. And the person who's next to my mom here is Ozella Smar, and that's my grandmother. And Ozella grew up in York, South Carolina, which is a very rural town in South Carolina. And as you can see in this second picture here, she doesn't look so healthy. And that is because Ozella lived for many years with untreated hypertension and developed end-stage renal disease and lived for 10 years on dialysis, which is a very long time to actually be on dialysis. A very sturdy woman, I'm told. And she died when I was, let me do some math here, 9 years old. And, you know, Ozella's life, of course, growing up in the Jim Crow era in South Carolina, had a lot of challenges. She and my dad's family, they were sharecroppers until my dad was 12, and my dad was born in 1954. So not uncommon in the South at that time, but here in the Midwest, that's really oftentimes very surprising to people. And then at one point in time, a black landowner had acquired land, and they were able to buy a parcel of land there and stop sharecropping and sort of do more of their own work at that point. But just thinking about Ozella's life and kind of this issue of, you have to work other people's land because no one will buy you land. You can't travel because you sure don't have a car. Experiences with the medical care system. I understand I did some oral history with my dad last night, which was really fun. I understand that there were 2 white physicians in the county in which they lived whom were very racist. And so racist that my grandmother gave birth to my dad breech at home in a one-room shack with snow coming through the roof. That's how much she didn't trust the physicians that were available to provide care to her. So when Ozella was on dialysis, she... Medicare, it sounds like, didn't pay for all of the costs of this, and the hospital had evidently, sought to get money, I think in the amount of $13,000, which was going to be all of the property and everything that my grandparents owned. And what ultimately happened was that my godfather bought my grandparents' house so that they wouldn't lose their remaining wealth, which was, really not very much. And if you kind of consider this experience, and what my dad had told me was that he talked to the hospital administrator and said, would you treat your own mom like this? And he said no, he wouldn't. So if you have these experiences and kind of see your parents go through this, or if you yourself are someone like my grandmother, you can imagine that when someone who is very likely, honestly, to be white from the university comes over to ask you to participate in their healthcare research study, you might have some questions about whether indeed these people truly have your best interests in mind. And I want to contrast that quickly with, this is my other grandmother. This is Kathleen Margaret Firestein. Here she is smoking she eventually had 11 kids. I don't know how many are in this picture. This is before they knew smoking was bad. And Kathleen had a very different life, probably for many reasons. And, again, things are beyond the issue of race. There are other factors in terms of geography and other factors that take place. But my grandmother had 3 major heart surgeries that were all identified as being needed very early. She lived to the age of 91. She met almost all of her great-grandchildren. As opposed to, when I think about Ozella, she had a lot of productive years of life that were taken from her. And really thinking about this issue of, health equity and what does health equity mean, and how can we conceptualize this in a way in which we really can kind of appreciate this as kind of our number one job. And health equity is really defined as the attainment of the highest level of health for all people. So in those narratives, I see opportunities where one person was able to attain their highest level of health. And my grandma actually passed away in her home, and she had all of her 11 kids surrounding her. She had great in-home hospice. Many people don't have those types of opportunities for reasons that relate to kind of daily issues with discrimination, racism, issues with how we treat people that have and do not have. And it's really important that when we think about goals of getting people into research studies so that they're included, so that they're represented, we need to understand that the way in which some groups have experienced life in our country is very different than the ways in which others have, and that very logically affects how they might feel. So I want to just point out that I think it's remarkable that many studies have demonstrated that despite all of that, it's okay, all of this is okay, don't feel bad about this stuff. I had great-grandmas and they're all fine, doing whatever it is they're doing now. Despite all of that, a lot of studies have demonstrated that, as a matter of fact, there's very little difference in willingness to participate in a range of clinical studies among minorities. Some studies do find differences in terms of some specific procedures, particularly around issues like brain donation or asking for other forms of body tissue where different cultures feel more or less comfortable with that. But I think this is really important for us to recognize, because we need to understand that despite the barriers and despite the experiences, we need to not assume that there have been some historical issues, there are contemporary issues we shouldn't even ask. That's not the right approach here. But things that we can do as healthcare providers or scientists or faculty or whomever, I think 2 really important things are collaborate and advocate. So this is kind of daily work type things. What are we going to do about this perpetual cycle of underrepresentation of research, lack of appropriate treatments, lack of appropriate interventions, health disparities. At some point, we have to start breaking down this cycle, and it's going to take a lot of big action. It's going to take a lot of policy action, but there are also things that we need to all take some accountability for doing in our day-to-day work. So with collaborating, working with researchers to facilitate recruitment and helping scientists introduce research opportunities to diverse populations at different points in care is very important. This is not something that scientists can do in isolation. And I know it's shocking, but something that happens when people progress in their scientific careers is they might become a little bit distant from the bedside. So we really need the voice of people that are in the thick of it to help us direct these activities. I'll be the first to own up to that. Actively partnering with researchers to improve recruitment, accrual, and retention practices. Very often, I think some of our best ideas for our recruitment have actually come from clinician partners, and making sure that you are vocal in suggesting approaches to recruitment that are equitable. So examples in terms of things that we're endeavoring to do in some of our work include if there are opportunities to identify unmet needs among populations that we know have a lot of unmet needs, calling people to task on doing something about that, I think is a very appropriate role for any healthcare provider. So obviously I'm a nurse, so I have to talk a lot about advocacy. Always being an active advocate for those in your care, and this really, I think, will help transcend a lot of issues with research equity that can come up at the bedside. Advocating for questions that aren't being asked, so it's entirely appropriate to tell people when they ask the wrong questions. We do it a lot. Or helping people understand if there are populations that are being omitted by the way in which we're asking the question. Those are things researchers would like to know. Questioning who's excluded from research studies. We recently learned from one of our partners that we're excluding some populations we'd actually really like to include by virtue of the setting that we're going to. So not understanding how insurance systems work and how some populations in our community may not have insurance, and that there are specific hospitals that those populations go to. I was unaware of some of those issues, so it helped us identify that we need to form new partnerships to make research opportunities available to those members of our community. And helping researchers understand things that we do that systematically exclude certain groups. This is really important. And I think this is actually one of the most effective things that we could all take away and try to question when we interact with a research study to create on-the-ground opportunities to expand access to research. Sometimes, as I had introduced, we have practices that systematically limit access. So if we require people to drive down here, and a lot of these patients lack transportation and we're out of the loop, be really vocal about that. We need to understand, no, you need to be driving to these people. You need to be meeting people in the community for this type of population and this type of work. And I want to encourage everyone to really try to become a health equity champion. And I know that sounds cheesy, but I think it's really important. This is something that I see a lot, particularly in talking to students, is that we have a practice of assuming that kind of diversity and equity and inclusion is someone else's job, usually someone of color, and they're going to do it, and then they're going to take care of that. This is everybody's job, and if we're in the healthcare profession and you're not on the health equity boat, I think you might be in the wrong profession, because we all want for everyone in our care to attain the highest level of health. So never assume that someone else is going to be the person that has voice and uses it to talk about issues related to inclusion and diversity. And this can be as minor as how we talk about a patient we take care of, how we talk about a patient that's been having perhaps socioeconomic difficulties. Othering happens in all of the contexts of our lives, and I know I see this a lot in my practice, talking about why someone hasn't been adherent with their medications. You know that you have a voice to help broaden how clinicians are talking about that, which broadens how we treat that. So really use that voice. Really, truly, lives do depend on that. Question biases and related to who's a good research participant. So if in some years now you're on the unit, maybe across the street here, and I annoyingly come over to try to ask you to recruit, and someone's going to approach one patient but not another, be the person that says, why aren't you talking to them? Did we make an assumption that that person's going to say no? Because they may. Everybody has the chance to do so, or they may not. We do know that referrals that we often get for our research studies don't represent the diversity of who clinically is being seen. So we're very interested in this issue of bias and how bias may be playing a role here. Be a vocal advocate for equitable research. So this includes calling people out, but also be a voice that when people poo-poo research, I know that it happens. You know, it's not always fun. It's sometimes hard to accommodate, but, you know, we do need more allies and voices that say research is important. Research needs to progress. It may have some inconveniences. How can we lessen them? We need to collaborate to move things forward. I talked about recognizing othering and also recognizing that negative experiences in healthcare have ripple effects. You heard, a little bit about Ozella's story. There's tons more that we could talk about Ozella's life, but you can see how that type of story takes up residence in people. You know, that's something that you really, that's a day in, day out. How do people treat people that way kind of question? And there are many members of our community that live with that sentiment. And we need to make sure that we're aware that we can inadvertently contribute to that sentiment if we're not really mindful of our interactions. So the way that we all treat those we care for affects this issue of research equity, and it affects the issue of health equity, and those go hand in hand. Just reiterating, bringing your perspective to the conversation about research. So I am done talking, but before I completely finish, I want to show a video of some wonderful students. I don't do anything in isolation, so it's kind of funny that I'm just up here talking by myself. But I have the great privilege of working with a spectacular team. And what I asked, I didn't micromanage anything anyone said. But we asked specific questions, and I think it's really important to show diverse perspectives. You've heard my perspective through my lens, and I want to show you a couple of other perspectives, and then we'll have a chance for some questions. All right. I can figure this out.
Health equity means to me that everybody has access to a better quality of life, despite their background, whether it has to do with socioeconomic class, gender, race, and all the other social identities. And it also means that everybody has the opportunity to reach their full potential of well health.
To me, health equity means understanding disparities that have been created over time and historical and current events and barriers that create those disparities and prevent health equity, and really understanding how we fit into that and being aware of that in interactions and in programs, interventions that aim to achieve greater health equity.
When I first heard health equity, I feel that it was a huge concept because I easily relate it to public health campaign or government policy which aim to ensure that everyone has the right to health care. But then I think about it again and zoomed in, tried to look close at it and place it to my own research context. For example, when we help chronic heart failure patients with multiple chronic conditions, health equity doesn't just mean give all the patients the same treatment, but rather consider the patient's preferences, goals, and values, and try to address the questions that matter most to them.
My work around health equity primarily revolves around some projects I've done on research equity. I had the opportunity to talk with some people who provide care for people living with changes in memory and who often don't have opportunities to participate in research. And I was able to ask them what they think research should look like. And I was really impressed by the experiences that they shared about being subject to a researcher's timeline or a researcher's needs and not having their needs, their priorities considered, and having the onus of understanding the research put on them. And I think that if we don't meet people where they're at, we won't achieve the participation that we need to truly discover in research, and that will prevent health equity down the road.
I worked with the UW School of Medicine and Public Health. We partnered with 4 communities in Wisconsin to address the black-white gap in infant mortality. In Wisconsin, black babies are 3 times more likely to die before their first birthday compared to white babies. We learned a lot about what health equity is, what health equity looks like, and what it means to partner with communities to achieve health equity. Some of the things we learned were about honoring and respecting Indigenous voices, having Indigenous voices lead and guide the work. We also learned what it meant to stay in our lane and to appropriately apply our expertise as we partnered with communities to address a really important issue.
What motivates me is when I was growing up, I had my parents actually immigrated here in the U.S. 20 years ago, and basically they had gone through a multitude of barriers against the healthcare system, which means that they had a language barrier and a knowledge barrier of how the healthcare system works in the U.S. So growing up, I was kind of their medical language translator, where I would teach the medical terminology, whether it be going through insurance plans or finding different doctors, and kind of just helping them bridge that gap between healthcare and them. So as I went to these places, these healthcare places, I saw lots of people like my parents who didn't understand the healthcare system quite as well as other people did. So for me, that's what motivates me. It's just the fact of going through the experiences that I have had and really using my experiences in a space where I feel like it's needed.
Health equity is not that far away from our daily life. As healthcare providers, we can really zoom in and get a close look at it and place it in our own daily context so that we can provide health equity to the patients through our contribution and efforts.
Clap for these people. These are the magical people. I wanted to make sure I acknowledge all of the wonderful people I get to work with. And I think we're going to transition to a Q&A panel for those that have questions. Thank you.
Okay, so to go ahead and get started, just really quickly, we would like the panelists to state how their work, who they are, and how their work intersects with health equity really fast, just so we know kind of a little bit of context.
Know me. I don't know that you need more context. So we'll move on to Amy.
Hi, I'm Amy Kind. I'm hoping my microphone's on. I'm an associate professor in I also direct our health services and care. I study health.
Hi, I'm Dorothy Edwards. I'm a professor in the program in occupational therapy, which is in the Department of Kinesiology. I'm also a professor of medicine. I'm the director of the Collaborative Center for Health Equity, and I'm one of the 2 PIs of the All of Us study, that's partially sponsoring this event. But I want to tell you about 3 different things. I was a CNA also. I worked for a summer on an acute geriatric floor in the 1960s, late 1960s, with a bunch of older people. And I didn't want to work there. I wanted to work in peace, but I was transformed by that summer. And I went back to school, changed my approach to graduate school, and I have a PhD. I'm a psychologist in aging and development. It changed my life that summer in that hospital. In my work, I'm really interested in cognition and the ability of older adults to live as independently as possible and to do complex activities of daily living. And I found occupational therapy because that's what OTs do, but most of my research until I came to UW was actually in people's homes. I studied black elders with cognitive impairment due to Alzheimer's disease and stroke, but one of my first big grants was actually to increase participation of African Americans in Alzheimer's research. I did a really brave thing. I took my research money and turned it into services. I created a home-based diagnosis and care management team led by a nurse. That team is still functioning in St. Louis to this day. It's evaluated more than 2,000 older adults living in the community, but because of that, the people who received those services allowed me to use their data, and I had a window into the lives of black elders living alone with dementia that was just transforming to me. I hope I helped them, but they helped me. And we've brought those service delivery models of recruitment to Madison and also to Milwaukee. So I really believe that the goal of an investigator is to identify where the problems are and to solve them, not to expect the community to come to me to help me do my work. In my work in the Collaborative Center for Health Equity, we promote health equity by increasing the diversity of the workforce. That means hoping that many of you will get graduate education and come to be professors or healthcare providers in our systems to make sure that we have true diversity in healthcare. We support health equity researchers by providing links to the communities. And we provide a great deal of training and resources. We have a summer Health Equity Leadership Institute for junior faculty and postdocs to help them navigate this complex system. The third thing I want to tell you is that I'm the PI of the All of Us study. All of Us is the first true effort on the National Institutes of Health to create a representative sample of individuals willing to participate in the research by providing biospecimens, health information, and ongoing access to their electronic health records. As of today, there are 109,000 people who have enrolled completely, and I'm really proud to say that 70% of the 109,000 people are from underrepresented groups. 50% are from racial and ethnic minority groups. This is the first time ever in the history of the National Institutes of Health that there is a truly representative sample. And I'm really proud that I'm part of that, and I hope some of you will consider participating.
Hi, everyone. I'm Betty Kaiser. I work here at the School of Nursing with the Wisconsin Network for Research Support. My colleagues and I provide consultation services to researchers who want to involve community and patient populations in research studies, get their input on research, get their input on health education materials. And our team has had the privilege of working very closely with Andrea and her team over the past several years, and they are strong users of one of our core services, which are 2 community advisory boards based at Madison Community Centers. These are the community advisors on research, design, and strategies, and these represent a wonderful opportunity for researchers, health educators, and anyone who wants to vet public-facing materials to bring them to the community and get unvarnished feedback from community members who are not embedded in academia and have a really valuable and fresh perspective to bring to the research enterprise.
Keep taking this mic. So thank you so much to our panelists. I have a few questions prepared, but I really want to leave it up to the audience. I know we have some stellar students in here. They probably have better questions than me. So would anyone like to ask questions?
Hi, can you all hear me? Oh, I can hear myself, so yeah. So here's my question. As you're thinking about how to achieve health equity in your own work, can you give us some examples of what you have done to empower patients, particularly sort of thinking about improving the lives of folks from a systems perspective?
Apologies, I have a dead battery. So I think that was a great question. Thank you very much for asking that. And I really think Andrea should answer this one as well. But I'm happy to offer that certainly within our group, there are a number of different approaches that are designed directly to ensure that the voices of the persons that are impacted most profoundly by some of these health disparities are at the table at all times. And from a systems perspective, I do think that one cannot underestimate the importance of the policy impact on health disparities, the potential for informing policy in such a way so that resources can be targeted more efficiently, more effectively to result in real change. There are entire fields of this work in the world of health policy. Additionally, in systems design of care delivery interventions, so often what we do is design a model of care that works very well within an academic setting, like the University of Wisconsin, but we aren't considering that most persons, and particularly most persons from vulnerable or disadvantaged backgrounds, are not receiving care within these ivory tower meccas. So thinking about getting out into the corners of the community, thinking about health policy, thinking about systems, I do think is a cornerstone of so much of what leads to real change. But I also don't want to lessen the importance of the other types of research, community-based participatory research, and all of the research methods, even basic science, to be frank with you. There are opportunities to understand more about the fundamental biology of disparities and what drives the differences in disease prevalence at the basic cellular level. So disparities is a responsibility for all of us. It's a responsibility regardless of the types of research we're interested in, the types of clinical policy or systems practice we're interested in. So my goal personally in coming here is not to necessarily get you to do anything but to consider that this is a problem that you all should be thinking about. You should be taking up the mantle of health disparities in whatever world you go into in the future and trying to make our world a much more equitable place.
Well, I feel that my work has changed systems, and I didn't intend to change systems when I started, but I was very fortunate. When I got my funding in 1991, I first thought about doing a needs assessment, and I was fortunate enough to have a group of black elders that I had worked with in the community who told me that if I didn't know what the needs were after spending 2 years with them, I was too stupid to get federal money. And they were right. They said, you know what we need services. So I did something really pretty outrageous. I took research money. The National Institutes on Aging normally doesn't pay for services. I took research money, created a home-based diagnosis and care management team that ran out of the Area Agency on Aging and the St. Louis City Health Department, and provided services and then recruited people for the research out of the individuals who were being served, who were actually more than willing to help us. And that model worked in St. Louis, and it was eventually, actually the federal money ended last year because they didn't need it anymore. The city of St. Louis has now doing home-based care management and diagnosis, a nurse-led team working out of the St. Louis Area Agency on Aging, paid for by Agency for Community Living, used to be the Administration on Aging dollars. They actually created a system, and I didn't start out to do that. In Milwaukee, when I came to Madison and was working in Milwaukee, the people in Milwaukee said, we need a memory clinic. And there's now a memory clinic in Milwaukee Health Services, a federally qualified health center, the very first one in the country. We took research money, put it into the community, and guess what? People in the community participate in research. The idea that people won't participate in research is ludicrous. It's that investigators don't go to where people are and meet the needs of the individuals before we ask. In other words, we're in a relationship. It's reciprocity. It's exactly what Dr. Gilmore-Bykowski said. It's a research relationship that's sustained. I get my questions answered. People get services. We work together to improve the quality of care and identify problems for elders with dementia or with stroke. It's not rocket science. It's just good work and being willing to take the risk of doing it. So this is sometimes a little bit risky, but I think it's worth doing. So I didn't set out to do systems work. I'm a psychologist. I think about individuals, but I think I've helped to affect systems change, and I think you can too. I think if you're committed to the problems of the individuals, you'll figure out a way of making the system responsive if you stake in, but it's not always easy. But I have a lot of help. I've gotten help from CARDS. It's actually possible to do this, and it's really, really wonderful work. Our participants give us far more than we give them.
I'd like to piggyback on what Dorothy said and to just point out that, an important system change is providing resources within training facilities like we have at UW to help researchers understand and develop skills in engaging community and engaging patients. It hasn't been a strong part of our training approach here, but we have many more robust resources now. We have an Institute for Clinical and Translational Research that provides pilot grants, small pots of money that help researchers get out there, get patients involved in the actual conduct and design and dissemination of their studies. So part of systems change is changing our approach to the way that we train researchers.
I think it's also critically important to be humble when you talk to these different communities, because just because you've talked to a certain community that looks a certain way, they may actually have very different needs and values from another community that may look similar but have different experiences. So I do think it's one of the things that is sometimes hard for us in academia to go in and say, I really don't know. You tell me. You tell me what's most important. You tell me how this needs to be designed, or am I even in the right ballpark? Do I need to be thinking about something else entirely? What direction should we go? And often it is something that that can be a little bit scary because you're giving up power, but it is ultimately the right way to proceed. And the research and the system and the policy and all of the work that moves forward ends up being of such a higher caliber, quality, and opportunity for impact. It really is wonderful. I think Andrea has a great example of this in some of the work that she's done actually in systems design in targeting persons with behavioral challenges and thinking about how some of those voices of participants need to be considered, and then thinking about how these designs can move forward.
Sure. Amy had said I should answer this. I was like, which project are you talking about? So I think Quentin asked a really fantastic question, which I think had two parts. One was about systems change, and another was about voice and hearing different voices. And I'll kind of introduce two different concepts of things that I asked my team to hold me accountable to, and that we try to hold each other accountable to. And I think, in a way, this is maybe a third point, which is you need an accountability system. There is a power differential between you and oftentimes the people that you study and research, and you really need to, some of this, is of course about research questions and objectives, and sometimes when you get into the area of addressing disparities and equity, it also becomes about principle. And an important principle in our work is that we honor and really explicitly seek the voice of people with dementia. We believe it's there, and we believe that we need to take steps to try to access it. And essentially amplify it wherever possible. And we do this both sort of in the way we ask our questions and in the way we try to include participants in our study. It's very hard to include people with cognitive impairment in research, but we really hold each other accountable to not letting that stop us, to going through all the hurdles, to having all of the meetings with all of my lovely colleagues in the IRB to help ensure that we do this in a way that is appropriate and has safeguards. But many examples we have include active studies where we recruit people with cognitive impairment that have decisional capacity. I have recruited people without decisional capacity into research and tried to include methods where we've tried to find ways to operationalize their contributions to care, ways for us to understand how they may view and receive care, because that's the intended recipient of all of my work. And it's really important that I don't allow there to be silence there. And I think that applies to many vulnerable populations, so I'll introduce that idea. So I think the concept of voice and finding all of the different mechanisms where you can allow research participants to have their voice heard is really important. And then my second plug would just be cards over here and winners, and really working. You do need experts and to collaborate with experts who have expertise
in how you engage and how you communicate and how you talk about your work in a way that others understand. It's not a skill that you are going to quickly acquire on your own. And there are resources here within the School of Nursing that I think are tremendously valuable to the campus to help us do that and to really check. You know, sometimes they'll have like this beautiful flyer or this wonderful introduction, and I really value the feedback of people telling me like I'm absolutely insane and no one will ever participate in the study, because I need to hear that. So just acknowledging that you really do need to have different accountability structures to make sure the voice is there. I want to make sure that we get to other questions. Do others have questions?
Andrea, I think you really hit it on the head in your talk, and I think Dorothy mentioned it as well, that there's sometimes a little bias on the part of researchers who feel it's easier to conclude that there are groups of people who aren't interested in research, that these people are hard to get, and so I'm just going to focus over here instead, which is an easier direction to go in for a lot of people. So to my mind, there needs to be sort of a change in the way we approach and train researchers. So speaking to that, I'm wondering what the panel thinks about how that kind of change can happen. And in specific, not thinking about the people who aren't in this room, the kinds of people who walk by the poster that's about health equity and say, oh, that's not me. So I'm just interested in what your thoughts about that. It's a hard question, I know.
Okay, I think it's a good question. I would suggest that an immediate low-hanging fruit opportunity would be to address terminology. That's really unhelpful in how we frame challenges. Terminology of recruitment, accrual, and retention is a very one-sided way to see people. First of all, these are people. So I think language that is a little bit, that perhaps better acknowledges the fact that you are engaging in a contractual agreement with others to give you something that they don't have to give you. And I think that what you're suggesting, I absolutely agree that a lot of the dialogue and terminology really puts the onus on others to do things that we ask them to do. And there really is no, other than we know why people participate. It's primarily altruistic reasons. It's a condition that's affected my family. It's a condition that's affected me. If you don't really tick those buckets and someone doesn't really jive with your study, there's no reason somebody should participate in your research. And honestly, if you flip that around, I probably wouldn't participate in a study that I didn't have motivations like that with. So I think the language that we use is a real barrier for how we view relationships that we enter into. And I think language that more appropriately establishes a greater degree of responsibility on investigators for how they proceed with this work would be really beneficial in kind of trying to modify some behaviors.
I'd like to say, too, just to add on that I agree with everything Andrea said, but let me also call out the fact that there are some individuals within the wider research community that do have biases. They may have racist tendencies. I wish it weren't true, but it is true. And I would argue that it's all of our responsibility to be vocal when things are said that are inappropriate and to challenge those beliefs in a way that can move the conversation forward. Unfortunately, they are things that we do hear, and they are often things that are said off the cuff, and it is something that ultimately impairs progress in a whole host of ways. So I just think that issue should be raised in this forum as well, because I do believe that it is something that we encounter, and it's something that it's all of our responsibility to check.
I'm going to agree with my colleagues and then go one step further So I think many investigators feel that if they hire inclusive research teams, they've met the standard of inclusivity in order to engage in communities. So if I have an African American or a Latino research coordinator or somebody who's doing outreach, that I'm actually a culturally aware investigator. I actually believe that investigators should be in the community doing recruitment first, whether it's in the hospital or in the community. I think as a PI, it's my obligation to experience what I'm doing and what I'm asking people to do. And I ask my fellow investigators all the time, how many studies have you volunteered for? Until you're on the other side of that consent form, you have no idea how it feels to be a subject or a participant, and it really changes your perspective. So I believe in research karma, and that we as investigators need to volunteer because we ask other people to volunteer. Now we're going to be this in May doing a training program for investigators on becoming culturally aware investigators, because the whole process starts with the principal investigator, the person who's responsible for the study. There used to be that if we could just teach people in the community the value of research, if we made them more literate, research literate, that everybody would do the right thing and volunteer. Not realizing that it's the tone of the materials. That's why cards is so important. I mean, we're three very, very experienced investigators, but we get embedded in our own work. We love what we're doing. We look at it all the time. We don't even see some of the issues that a set of fresh eyes from the community will see. I had what I thought was a absolutely fabulous introduction to a project looking at barriers to research participation. Took it to cards. Boy, they cut it up. They asked me a lot of questions, and I think as investigators, going to community advisory boards, going to cards, and hearing the perspective of potential participants changes your view of how what you think is so clear, is so implicit. We have a lot of implicit knowledge. Of course we know what we're talking about. Why don't you know what I'm talking about? That it's really an eye-opening experience, and I have been doing this work since the 1980s, and I still need to bring my work to an independent group to tell me how they hear what I'm trying to say. And so I don't think experience is enough. I think you have to be open to hearing what people think about what you're doing and what you're trying to do, and also own your mistakes. I thought that was a great idea, but clearly it's not.
Susan, I just want to acknowledge that bias and those biases and assumptions, they play out on a very micro level. Recruitment is relational, and what we hear from our community partners all the time is that, I want somebody who's speaking language I understand, who respects me, and who's not making assumptions about me. And I think because we're so reliant on clinicians like nurses to be part of this recruitment machine, that we often think, well, that person's trained as a nurse, he's an excellent communicator, she's really good with a personal touch, that we overlook the importance of the plain language in the approach, and having a consistent approach and training recruitment personnel with that consistency in mind, which is one reason that the cards over the past 5 years have reviewed dozens of recruitment scripts. Something that, an invitation that often happens on the fly, just according to one person's personal style, systematize that so that the same message is delivered to every patient. Everyone has the same opportunity, and, people aren't excluded on the basis of assumptions.
So I'm hoping we might have one more question, and I want to comment on that and say we did have a partner here who I think had left, who was a physician in the hospitalist division, who has been really wonderful in helping us try to find other ways we can recruit from other populations. And we had a very similar thing where essentially I had a lot of interactions with providers, and in the end they were like, I'm not going to approach patients for you because a nurse needs to do this. And not any nurse, a specific group of nurses that are dedicated, that appreciate what you're trying to do with improving research representation and connecting people to services. And then we formed a relationship with those nurses, but they helped us identify this issue of we actually can't do this job very well. And actually, not just any nurse can do this job well for you, but if you want to do it well, we need to take a different approach. So really thinking, I really agree with the sentiment of, you can't just kind of hand the baton to anyone and just assume that they have your values and can accomplish this work for you. And that's why we need voices from people who are at the bedside to help us understand some of those nuances that we may not really be in tune to. There was another question.
Yeah, so I have what's maybe, it's also a tricky question, and it's maybe more something that I wrestle with that I'd be curious to just hear perspectives on. So I'm a population health PhD student, and I'm really interested in patient experiences in healthcare, especially for marginalized populations, and disparities in health equity are things that are really important to me, and I am interested in limited English proficient and so on. I'm not trying to talk all about myself. What I'm trying to say is I'm also very aware that I am a white woman, and I think a lot about that, and I think a lot about just that as part of interests in rectifying disparities and sort of weighing between using the privilege I have and the desires I have to do this research with not wanting to come in and be saving. I mean, it's really complicated. So I guess I've been sitting here trying to figure out how to formulate this question, and I still haven't really come up with it. But I'm very curious about if, I imagine some of you might have wrestled with similar things, or just any perspectives on that you might have. Thank you.
Andrea wanted me to reply to it. I'm a white woman doing diversity work, and I've been in this role for 6 years, so I'm asked a lot. I've been to diversity conferences, and they're like, "You're the diversity officer? You're the only white woman? What are you doing? Why are you doing this?" And to that, I would say that it's all of us. It's all of our roles to be doing this. It's going to look different as a white woman doing it than a person of color. And one way to take action is to name your own whiteness, to own it. A lot of times researchers go in, we live in a colorblind world, and they're like, "I'm just a researcher. I'm a well-intended woman." They'll say they're a woman, but they won't race themselves as white. So I think saying you're a white woman, especially in this climate, is a radical act. So I think naming that and having those conversations is one way to do that and build those relationships. Because you already owned your privilege, but it's going to look different. The work is going to look different. Doing the racial justice work as a white person is never going to be the same. I'm never going to experience the same thing as an underrepresented person would in a healthcare setting. I'm never going to experience it. I don't know what that feels like, and I don't want to try to relate and say I have the same experience. I never will. So I think it's important to realize that it's going to look different, but that doesn't mean that you don't have a role or that you're not accountable for doing the social justice work.
So I'm obviously a white woman, and I have been doing this work for a long time, and I think there's some really simple rules that involve very much what Mel said, but a real cultural humility. I am not the expert. I'm the outsider. I need to understand. So the first thing you do is you show up. You're present. And you're present as often as you need to be. And you only speak when you're asked to speak. You don't come in as the expert. You're there. And so first you show up. You show respect. You speak when you're asked to speak. And if you make a commitment, you do your absolute to keep it. And I mean to keep it. Because that's the nature of the relationship. I spent working on recruitment for the Wisconsin Registry for Alzheimer's Prevention in Milwaukee. I spent 2 years with my colleague Gina Green Harris, who is from Milwaukee, kept reminding me that I wasn't in St. Louis anymore, and that what I did in St. Louis was great, but it wasn't going to work in Milwaukee. I spent 2 years, 3 days a week, sometimes 4 days a week, going to events, speaking on brain health, talking about the value of research, never once asking somebody to participate in a study until people asked me if there was anything I needed. And then I talked about it, and we had tremendous response. And I think that one of the things to remember for those of you who are junior investigators is you have to budget for appropriate time for engagement. Recruitment does not happen in the minute. It happens over months or years when people trust you, and the only way to trust is to be present and to show that you're trustworthy. I also own the problems of my institution, and I don't think UW has as many problems as Washington University in St. Louis did. It had a history of horrible treatment of African American patients, keeping black women who were pregnant in the basement of a hospital in the summer when it was 100 degrees out. I had to own that and say, yes, I understand. Tell me more. Tell me more. I need to hear it. I can't fix it, but at least I can acknowledge it. And so I learned a lot about cultural humility, and the fact that people were even willing to talk to me was pretty amazing. And it was out of that experience that the program that actually worked for recruitment grew, because we were meeting the need that the community said it had. But they couldn't have even told me what the needs were until they knew that I was ready to listen, because you have to be available to listen and not argue, and that's really hard sometimes, particularly with deadlines. No, I'm serious. Sometimes you have to say, I know you want me to get this done in 3 months, and we're having that issue with all of us. You know, the assumption is that I can tell you about a project, I'm asking for your biospecimens, I'm asking you to give me health information, and oh, by the way, I want ongoing access to your electronic health record, and I'm going to talk to you once, and you're going to flock and sign up for the $25 remuneration. It doesn't work that way. But fortunately, enough people believe in the project to participate, and over time the participation will grow, but we'll do it the right way.
So I am also a white woman. I come from a very socioeconomically disadvantaged background, though. I grew up in a part of the country where poverty is common, where there isn't enough health care resources, and in particular mental health issues do not get addressed very, very well. There's currently a massive opioid epidemic, and even issues like transportation and housing are few and far between with any sort of social support or social services. So I would argue that we each come from very, very different backgrounds, regardless of what we look like. And I would also argue that health disparities are all of our responsibility, regardless what we look like. Because unless we all come together as a community, real change will not happen. This is the question you ask is actually something that many of the mentees that I have asked me too. And one of the responses that I always like to give is that if every university professor on this campus and every campus across the country decided to turn all of their work towards health disparities, I am so sorry, but I am afraid we will still have a health disparities problem in the United States, because it won't just be solved by researchers. It won't just be solved by academicians. It's going to take a multi-system effort that includes community workers and health systems, policymakers, educators. The list goes on and on and on. So if you have the desire and the genuine wish to get involved, and you have enough humility, like Dorothy was saying, and can express enough trust and understand your own background, and that you may bring a certain element to the table that hasn't been heard before or could be really valuable, then I would encourage you to move forward on your goals.
I'm looking at Mel because I think we're going to be out of time soon. Okay, we have 5 minutes. 4, somewhere in that region. I would just add to that, I think it's really important that you've asked that question. And someone that was here but that I think had to go was Laura Block, who was in the video, who has contributed a lot to some of our research projects and raises this question a lot. So she's going to be really happy to hear that someone asked this question, which is kind of calling and just being very aware and reflective of our views and experiences and biases that we all have and what they bring. And I think, a kind of common theme here would just be the importance of developing a sense of self-awareness and being really authentic about who you are. And just trust me, people will know. There's no facade that's going to save you. When if I go and talk to people and they can say, this woman really is desperately intense about dementia care, like it's pretty clear, and then there may be other areas where really if it's not genuine, it doesn't come through. But I think that your genuine aligned motivations can help forge diverse and really valuable relationships. And I think it's really important, kind of building off of what Amy said, not to assume that concordance or discordance is kind of the goal. People, you saw that my family background is diverse, to use a generic word. But my dad's family's in South Carolina. I was primarily raised with my mom's family, who comes from Milwaukee, from a long line of German Catholic people where your sheets need to be folded right and all of this wonderful stuff. So, that doesn't mean that I have the same experience as someone else that looks like me. I was raised in a particular way, and it's not necessarily the same as someone else. So just realizing that just, because you look like someone or don't look like someone doesn't mean you're the same as them or you understand them. And this kind of applies to all aspects of life. And kind of how we interact with people, and just being really aware of what you bring from your background, I think, is really important, especially in healthcare and how we interact with our patients. Those things can come up in really subtle ways if we don't have a good self-awareness.
I'd just like to briefly say that we haven't used the word transparent yet in this answering this particular question, but I think transparency, as numerous people have said, know who you are and be transparent about why you're coming to the table, what are your motivations, what are you expecting to get out of it, what are your expectations of your partners, and then listen to the same from them. What are their motivations and what are they expecting to get out of it? And then also, that I try to have the default of people are doing the best they can. And to just, to trust, not, things are scratchy, lots of times, but to default to trying to create win-win situations, framing things that don't go well as positive learning experiences in some sense, and just, having that belief that we are in this together and that we can support each other even when things get a little scratchy.
You're telling me we're out of time, so I'd like to take time to thank all the panelists. Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks, everyone. Oh, the presentation was fabulous.